All right, so today we're diving into a place that's practically synonymous with security and wealth, Fort Knox. We're talking about the gold, the history, the myths, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, Fort Knox, it's one of those places that really captures the imagination, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and we've got some great sources to dig into today, Wikipedia, some really insightful financial news articles, and even a PBS documentary with interviews from people who've worked at Fort Knox.
Oh, wow, first-hand accounts. That's awesome.
Yeah, it should be really interesting. So to kick things off, let's start with the basics. What exactly is Fort Knox and what makes it so famous?
Well, it's actually two things. It's a U.S. Army base, and it's also the location of the U.S. Bullion Depository.
The bullion depository?
Yeah, the gold vault.
Oh, right, of course. So it's not just about the gold. I have to admit, when I hear Fort Knox, I just think mountains of gold bars.
I think that's most people's first thought. But yeah, the Army Post has its own whole history and functions separate from the gold depository. It's been an active base since World War I, actually.
Wow, I had no idea it went back that far. But okay, the gold, that's what really put Fort Knox on the map, right? It's become this pop culture symbol of like ultimate security.
Definitely. When you want to say something is super safe, you say it's as safe as Fort Knox.
Exactly. But does it actually live up to the hype? Is the security really that impressive?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely explore.
Okay, before we get to that, let's talk location. Where exactly is this legendary fortress?
Fort Knox is located right in the middle of Kentucky.
Kentucky. Really, I always pictured it somewhere more remote.
Well, it was chosen for strategic reasons. Back in the 1930s, when they were building the gold depository, the government was worried about attacks from the sea.
Ah, so they wanted to keep the gold as far inland as possible.
Exactly. And Kentucky was perfect because of the Appalachian Mountains.
The mountains provide a natural barrier.
Right. Makes it much harder to access.
Okay, that makes sense. Very strategic. So we've got an army base and a gold depository all tucked away in the Kentucky hills protected by mountains. Starting to sound like something out of a movie. But let's back up a bit. Who owns and runs each part of Fort Knox?
Well, like we said, it's two separate entities. The Army base is run by the Department of Defense,
Right, that makes sense.
but the gold depository that's managed by the U.S. Treasury Department.
Interesting. So they have their own separate setup for the gold.
Yeah, they even have their own special police force, the U.S. Mint Police.
No way. A dedicated police force just for the gold? That's serious.
It shows you how seriously they take security there. Now, this brings us to a question I'm sure everyone is wondering.
Can you actually visit Fort Knox?
Well, it depends on what you want to see.
Okay, let's say I want to see the gold vault. Is that possible?
Unfortunately, no. The old vault itself is completely off limits to the public.
Ah, that's a bummer. But I guess it makes sense with all that gold and security. It's probably best not to have tourists wandering around.
Right. But it's not a total shutout. The Army Post itself actually has some areas open to the public, like the General George Patton Museum.
Oh, the Patton Museum. Now that I would love to see.
It's definitely worth checking out if you're ever in the area. But for now, let's get back to that gold. How much is actually there?
Yeah, we hear it's a lot of gold, but like how much is a lot?
Well, officially, Fort Knox holds 147.3 million ounces of gold.
147.3 million ounces. Okay, that's a lot. But gold prices fluctuate. What's all that gold worth today?
Well, the official book value, based on a 1973 price, is $6.22 billion.
1973. That's like ancient history when it comes to gold prices. It'd have to be worth way more now.
Oh, definitely. At today's market value, it's estimated to be worth over $273 billion.
Wow. Okay, now I'm starting to understand all the security. $273 billion worth of gold. That's enough to make anyone a little paranoid. But with all that gold and all that secrecy, it's no surprise that there are some wild conspiracy theories floating around. Like, is the gold at Fort Knox even real?
That's a question that's been circulating for decades. Some people believe it's been swapped out with fakes. Others think it's been stolen completely.
It sounds like a movie plot. But seriously, is there any truth to these claims?
Well, there's no evidence to support those theories, but the fact that the public can't access the vault definitely adds to the speculation.
So how do we know the gold is actually there?
Well, there have been audits over the years, though the specifics of those audits are highly classified, of course.
Audits? Okay, so someone is checking to make sure the gold is actually there. That's good to know. But how often do these audits happen? Like, is there a yearly gold count or something?
That's a great question, and it's something that sparks a lot of debate. The audits aren't on a set schedule. We know that the last major audit was back in the 1970s.
The 1970s. Wow, that's a long time ago. No wonder people are suspicious.
Yeah, and some people argue that for the sake of transparency and accountability, more frequent audits are necessary.
I can see that point. It is a massive amount of national treasure.
Exactly. But then again, keeping the audit schedule unpredictable adds another layer of security.
That's true. If no one knows when the auditors are coming, it makes it harder to plan anything shady.
Right. It's a tough balance between security and transparency.
For sure. A classic dilemma. But shifting gears a bit, let's tackle another big question. Is Fort Knox truly the most secure place in the world?
That's the reputation it has. But is it true?
It's what everyone says, but is it just hype or is there something to it? What do our sources say?
Well, our sources definitely list it as one of the most fortified locations in the world, but none of them definitively declare a winner in the global security Olympics.
I guess that makes sense. No one wants to boast by having the best security, only to have someone try to prove them wrong. But what do we know about Fort Knox's defenses? What makes it so supposedly impenetrable?
Well, for starters, picture this. Layers upon layers of protection, concrete walls, reinforced steel, a network of fences topped with razor wire, and of course, armed guards everywhere.
Okay, that's starting to sound pretty intense, but is that all? I feel like there has to be more to it than just walls and guards, especially these days.
Oh, absolutely. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Our sources mention a sophisticated surveillance system too, motion sensors, thermal imaging, probably a lot of other high-tech stuff they're not telling us about.
Right, it can't just be guys with flashlights patrolling the perimeter. We're talking billions of dollars worth of gold here.
Exactly. And the PBS documentary goes into some detail about the training those guards undergo. It's intense. Weapons handling, combat tactics, even something called room clearing.
Room clearing. Okay, now I'm picturing some serious action movie scenarios. So we've got the physical barriers, the high-tech surveillance, the highly trained guards. What about the vault itself?
Ah, the vault. Now that's where it gets really interesting. One detail that really stood out to me was the weight of the vault door.
How heavy could it be?
20 tons.
20 tons. That's like 2 elephants. You'd need more than a crowbar to get through that. But with all these security measures in place, have anyone ever actually tried to break into Fort Knox?
You know, it's not just a movie plot. While there haven't been any successful breaches reported, there was a shooting incident on the Army base back in 2013.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. Thankfully, it wasn't related to the gold depository, but it does show that no place is completely immune to security threats.
That's a good point. Even with all those defenses, Fort Knox isn't entirely invulnerable. But getting back to the security measures themselves, what else can we learn about how they protect the gold? Are there any more details in our sources?
Well, the really juicy details are highly classified, as you can imagine.
Right, it adds to the mystery.
Exactly. But we can piece together a pretty good picture from what has been revealed.
So we've got the visible stuff, the fences, the razor wire, the guard towers.
Right, those are the obvious deterrents. But then there's the hidden layer of electronic surveillance, motion sensors, thermal imaging pressure plates, who knows what else. It's like something out of a spy thriller.
It makes sense they're protecting billions of dollars worth of gold or they wouldn't leave anything to chance. But it's not all about technology, is it? There's still the human element, the guards themselves.
Absolutely. The U.S. Mint Police, the folks specifically dedicated to protecting the depository, they're not just watching monitors. They're actively patrolling, constantly monitoring for anything suspicious and ready to respond to any threat.
And like we mentioned before, they undergo rigorous training for all kinds of scenarios. They're practically a special forces unit for gold.
Exactly. It's a level of security that's hard to grasp unless you've been there and seen it firsthand.
And even then, you're only seeing the surface, right? The real extent of Fort Knox's defenses remains a closely guarded secret.
That's right. It's a reminder that while we can speculate and analyze all we want, there are some secrets that Fort Knox will likely keep hidden for a long time to come.
Speaking of secrets, there's one thing that really stood out to me in those financial news articles. We keep hearing about the fluctuating value of gold and the rise of digital currencies like Bitcoin. It makes me wonder, what is the future role of a place like Fort Knox in this rapidly changing financial world?
That's a question a lot of experts are grappling with. Some argue that physical gold reserves are becoming less relevant in a world where digital transactions are taking center stage.
Yeah, I can see that point. You can't exactly transfer a gold bar through the internet. So is Fort Knox destined to become a relic of the past, a giant museum dedicated to a bygone era of finance?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Others argue that gold will always hold intrinsic value. It's a safe haven asset during times of economic uncertainty.
Because it's tangible, it's finite, it has a history that stretches back thousands of years.
Exactly. It's a hedge against the volatility of the digital world, something solid and dependable in a world that's constantly changing.
So it's really a debate about the future of gold and by extension the future of Fort Knox. It's a fascinating microcosm of the larger conversation about how we value things, how we protect what we deem important, and how we navigate a world where the very definition of value is constantly evolving.
Absolutely. It's a lot to think about. But one thing's for sure, Fort Knox, with all its history, its mystery, and its gold, it's going to continue to capture our imaginations for a long time to come.
Absolutely. It's a symbol of American strength, security, and maybe even a little bit of paranoia. It's a reminder that even in a world that's increasingly digital and intangible, There are still places where real tangible value resides, protected by layers of security that would make even the most cunning thief think twice.
Yeah, it really highlights that tension on security versus transparency.
Right, it's a tough one, but okay, let's get back to those conspiracy theories for a second, specifically the one about the gold being fake or stolen. It's like a real-life treasure hunt mystery.
It's funny how those theories have evolved over time. It used to be all about someone's physically breaking in and stealing the gold.
Yeah, like a classic heist movie.
Exactly. But these days, the speculation is a lot more nuanced. Even people like Elon Musk have gotten in on the action.
Wait, Elon Musk, the Tesla and SpaceX guy, what does he have to say about Fort Knox?
Well, one of the financial news articles we have talks about how Musk has publicly questioned the legitimacy of the gold reserves at Fort Knox.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's even called for a live video walkthrough of the facility to prove that the gold's actually there and hasn't been swapped out for something else.
I guess even billionaires can't resist a good conspiracy theory, but is there any actual evidence to support these claims of tampering or substitution? What do our sources say?
Unfortunately, that's where things get a little murky. The exact auditing procedures at Fort Knox are top secret.
Right, classified.
Exactly. So while there's no evidence of any wrongdoing, that lack of transparency does leave room for doubt.
So it basically comes down to trusting the government.
In a way, yes. And that's why this topic is so controversial. People want reassurance. They want to know that their nation's gold reserves are safe and sound.
It's not just about the money either. It's about symbolism, trust, and the idea that something of value is being protected.
You got it. It's like that feeling you get when you put something important in a safe place. You want to be sure it's still there when you need it.
Right, but on a much larger scale, obviously. But okay, let's move on from the conspiracy theories and talk about something a little more concrete. What can our sources tell us about the actual security measures in place at Fort Knox? What makes it so secure?
Well, as you can imagine, the really specific details are highly classified.
Makes sense. Got to keep those secrets.
Right. But we can still paint a pretty good picture from what has been revealed over the years.
Okay, so what do we know?
Well, for starters, there'll be obvious deterrents. The fences, the razor wire, the guard towers.
Right, the stuff you see in pictures?
Exactly. But then there's the hidden layer of security, the electronic surveillance.
Things like motion sensors, thermal imaging, pressure plates.
All that, and probably a whole lot more that we don't even know about.
Like something out of a spy movie.
Exactly. And then there's the human element, the guards themselves.
The U.S. Mint Police.
Right. They're not just sitting around watching monitors. They're actively patrolling, constantly on the lookout for anything suspicious and ready to respond to any threat.
And they undergo that intense training we talked about earlier for all kinds of scenarios.
Right. And not your average security guards. It's a level of security that's really hard to comprehend unless you've seen it firsthand.
And even then, you're only seeing a small part of it. The full extent of Fort Knox's defenses is a closely guarded secret.
Exactly. It makes you realize that while we can speculate and analyze all we want, there are some things about Fort Knox that will probably always remain a mystery.
That's true. You know, with all this talk about security and gold, it's easy to forget about the bigger picture. What about the future of a place like Fort Knox? I mean, with the value of gold fluctuating and the rise of digital currencies like Bitcoin, is Fort Knox still relevant?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. Some experts believe that physical gold reserves are becoming less important in a world that's increasingly digital.
Yeah, I can see that. Makes sense.
But there's another side to that argument. Some experts believe that gold will always have intrinsic value.
Because it's tangible, it's finite, it has a long history.
Exactly. It's a hedge against the volatility of the digital world, something solid and dependable in a world that's constantly changing.
So it's really a debate about the future of gold itself, and by extension, the future of Fort Knox. It's a microcosm of this larger conversation about value security and how we navigate a world where the very definition of value is in flux.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to think about, and it's something we'll definitely have to keep exploring as the financial landscape continues to evolve. Yeah, it's a fascinating debate for sure, and it really underscores those fundamental questions about value and security that we keep coming back to.
Right. It makes you think. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back in one more thing we touched on earlier, the idea of transparency and the public's right to know.
Ah, yes. The tension between national security and keeping the public informed. It's a tough one.
Definitely, especially when you're talking about something as sensitive as a nation's gold reserves.
Absolutely. There's a fine line to walk. There's a need to protect sensitive information, but also a responsibility to maintain public trust.
Right. If people don't believe that the gold is actually there or that it's being properly managed, it could lead to all sorts of problems.
Exactly. It could undermine confidence in the entire financial system.
So it's a balancing act. And it's not just about Fort Knox either. It's a challenge that governments and institutions face all over the world.
Absolutely well said, and it's something to keep in mind as we conclude our deep dive into Fort Knox. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the history and location to the security measures and those persistent conspiracy theories.
It's been a wild ride. We've talked about mountains of gold, high-tech surveillance systems, and even Elon Musk's take on it all.
It's amazing how much there is to uncover when you really start digging into a place like Fort Knox. It's a symbol of American strength, security, and intrigue. It's a place that sparks curiosity and debate. And it's a reminder that even in our increasingly digital world, there are still places where real tangible value resides protected by layers upon layers of security.
It's a place that captures the imagination for sure. So as we leave the heavily guarded gates of Fort Knox behind us, we leave you, our listeners, with one final thought. In a world that's constantly changing, what is the future of a place like Fort Knox? Is it a relic of the past or a symbol of enduring value? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Fort Knox. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking knowledge wherever you can find it.